Thank you, Basil. Can you all hear me? I guess we're not using mics other than for the recording, so if you don't hear me, just let me know and I'll speak closer to the mic. Thank you, Basil, for giving me the opportunity to talk about my research. I've been working on this for about 9 months now, I think, so it's really exciting to actually share it with a wider audience. As said, my postdoctoral position is supported by the Energy Education Trust, so I've been working with them for almost 3 years now. The title is Disruptive Technologies and Solar Potential in Auckland, with a big focus on solar and how that possibly could be, or would it be, a disruptive technology or not. So the outline is the following. I'll give a short introduction of what are disruptive technologies. Then the main bulk of my talk will be on the solar potential in Auckland, the results of my study and how I got there. After which Tony will talk about incentives for solar investment, on one hand from the perspective of consumers in different situations, so possibly in different neighbourhoods in Auckland, and on the other hand from the New Zealand perspective. So what's technology innovation? There's a professor from Harvard who nailed the term of disruptive technologies and what they mean. So he's saying innovation in a technology can either be sustaining or disruptive. A sustaining innovation for a technology is something that is just an upgrade or an incremental improvement to the existing technology. So the market remains the same. It will just have new products that will do a better job for the same money, or the same job for a less amount of money. Whereas a disruptive technology or disruptive innovation is something that will eventually take over the market. So it's a new approach, a new way of doing something. It supposedly will change our lives or the way we work, the way we do things. So that makes it disruptive. A classic example from history is the automobile. When automobiles were invented, they were expensive luxury items, and that didn't really change much per se. So only when the Ford Model T came around, that made automobiles available for everyone. So it was the innovation in mass production of automobiles that made automobiles a disruptive technology, and that then, as we know, changed everything. So that was about 30 years after the first automobiles came into the market. So the combination of prices going down and the availability that made automobiles available. The McKinsey Global Institute, they have now recently, a couple of years ago, released a report on disruptive technologies currently. So what would be the emerging technologies? Of all emerging technologies, which ones might be the disruptive ones that can change the way we work and live and do things? And they're looking at them from the perspective of a market. So in dollars, what's the potential in dollars? And on the other hand, from the perspective of how many lives might this technology have an impact on? So just in how widely could these technologies spread? And among those 12, you have, I'm not sure if you can probably read them. You have energy storage as one and renewable energy as another. So which kind of brings me to the topic of solar PVs with batteries. Both have seen decreases in prices recently and increases in deployment. So if in combination they might become a disruptive technology or not, we'll see. But it looks they're being hyped and promised to be such technologies. So just a quick on where is solar at the moment globally. Solar capacity. So this is PV solar, so electricity produced from solar panels. It's the most common technology on rooftops with solar panels. So you can use solar panels for heating or electricity. Most commonly it's in New Zealand. I've seen the PVs more. And so that's to produce electricity with solar panels, so photovoltaic PV. And the global capacity has gone up by 10-fold in the last 10 years. I don't have the latest numbers here, but I kept this graph because it kind of just shows where it's happening. Being increased in Europe, so driven by Germany. And then, of course, as well, the Asia-Pacific, big increases in China in the last 2 years. The current number is around, in 2015, was around, I think, 240 or 250 gigawatts. So that's a 10-fold increase in less than 10 years. That's, of course, come about with both policy and price reductions. So this graph is from Bloomberg from 2014. So you can see the price reductions in PV systems. This is utility scales, but the price reductions for modules, inverters, and balance of plant components can be assumed to be the same. So the first 4 years here until 2014 would be actual data, and the rest is then a projection for the future, what we expect, where we expect the costs of PV panels to go, or PV systems. And again, there's been the costs have halved more or less in 4 or 5 years. So that will then, on one hand, drive the deployment of PV panels. Where that cost reduction comes from, on one hand, processing costs have decreased. That is mainly hinting at production moving to China. So a lot of production from Europe, it's more expensive to produce there. So in China or in Asia, production costs are lower. Fall in polysilicon costs. So polysilicon is the main ingredient, so to say, in PV panels, the main substance for semiconductors. So the material that you see, the crystalline, it's made of silicon. Improvement in PV efficiency, so you get more energy per dollar invested. And the Deutsche Bank, that's from a different report, not the Bloomberg report, have said that there would be an additional 30 to 40% reduction in PV costs, mainly from scale and then also from efficiency improvements. So all this is hinting in a good direction for that disruptive technology talk. What's happening in New Zealand? We've seen similar trends in the past few years. In New Zealand, the installed capacity has gone from 5 megawatts, roughly from 5 megawatts to 35 in the last 2-3 years. And this, the left-hand graph is for the main cities in New Zealand, so it doesn't show the whole total of the country, just to show the relevance of Auckland mainly, because that kind of motivates my study. But of course, Christchurch looks good there as well. And then the graph on the right shows the projection from MBIE, so from the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And their central projection study, or projection for the future, would show growth to about 250 megawatts by 2050. More importantly is that the big growth will be in the residential sector. That's what they're expecting. So not large scale installations really. And then to the study that we've done here at the Energy Centre. I'd like to, first of all, I don't know if anyone's from Auckland Council. They provided the Lidar data. I'll talk about the Lidar data in a sec. And so I'd like to acknowledge from there Anna Kerpo and Nathan Sykes, who I was in contact with about the data. And then Basil has obviously supported this research the whole way. And Vincent is a PhD student from geography who's been using the same data set that I have. So he was quite helpful in getting me started, because this is the first time I use Lidar data and ArcGIS and some of the software. So just to get started and start getting an idea of what's best for what. So I'd like to acknowledge him as well. This image is actually an image of that data from a certain angle, because you get 3D models, so you can kind of play with it. But I'll show other images. So LiDAR data. LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. It's a quite common remote sensing tool where you use planes to fly over a surface and you send light signals or light pulses down and record the time it takes for them to get back. So the signal that comes back, it can be reflected from several surfaces, from the top of the tree, from leaves, and then finally from the ground. So record for each signal how long it takes to come back for each of the returns, and then what's the intensity of each of the returning signals. So you have some information of the surfaces that it's reflected back from. So Auckland Council did such a survey for Auckland region. That's the region shown in pink rectangles, tiles. It's about 5,000 tiles, and each tile is about 200 times 300 meters big. So that's a huge set of data. I'll just have an example of, if you just plot the data, you'll get something like this. So it is elevation data. You convert it into elevation from the ground or from sea level, and you can see the trees, roads, hills, buildings. And can anyone see where that is? Yes. Yeah, so there's a bit of Eden Park at the very end, so it's kind of watching north Mount Eden. Indeed. Sorry?
Is red good?
Red is high. The color coding is just low or high. It's just elevation data, so it is just plotted it as is.
What's the resolution of this? I mean, sorry, the resolution of the distances, the distances in the logo.
Yeah, the height resolution I'm coming that it's about 10 centimeters, plus minus.
Measure distance down to 10 centimeters.
Yeah. So this is just a close-up where you can then actually see that it is point data. So it is quite a lot of points. You can see the trees, you can see the rooftops. Maybe I can point at the points. So you can see houses, and you can see actually here where I've cut off, you can see the shapes of the rooftops quite clearly, the profile of them. So that's what I start off with. So the approach is to take the Auckland region. Since it's a huge set of data, it's better to group it into subsets so that I can deal with one area at a time and so that my computer can handle it. But also so that I can then compare neighborhoods and compare different areas of Auckland. So I've used Census 2006 area units. The two Census 2013 ones were already bigger units. They were 18 or 19, so they were really big. So I wanted to go this more detailed level. I've eliminated the neighborhoods or the suburbs that are only half covered by the LiDAR data. And I've also eliminated tidal areas and marinas and harbors that don't have any buildings, and some large areas that have only a few residential houses, so were mainly covered by forest. So the white text have kind of been eliminated there. Sorry. So in the end, I have 334 different suburbs. And the aim is then to use the data to calculate the solar potential on the rooftops. So find the rooftops and calculate the solar potential on them. I'll now show in steps how I get from the LiDAR data to actual solar potential. So what you first do is you look at as I said, you have different returns from the light pulses, light signals, and you look at the last returns, which will give you the ground. So you get just the bare ground without trees or buildings. And that will look something like this. So I have overlaid the contour lines on them just to make it more clear. So I have that little area, Mount Eden. The area marked in green is apparently called Sherborne, but my colleagues said that just call it Mount Eden, because that's what we know it better as. So you'll see it's quite detailed there. Even in black and white, it wouldn't look as good. On top of that, then I take the first returns. So that's called the digital surface model. So I take the first returns that have the top of the trees, the top of the buildings, the rooftops, and combining them together, I get the full kind of 3D model, surface model of the region. Then, on the other hand, from Auckland Council again, I got the building footprints, which are shown in yellow on the left side, just so that I can focus on the rooftops per se and do the calculations from here on, just on rooftops. That'll save me a lot of calculation space as well. So I take the rooftop images and use the 3D model to just pick out the rooftops. And then I have the elevation data for that. So from that, I can start calculating slope, for example, aspect, and the solar potential. So I have, this looks like a pixel, so it's a raster file. I have a square for each square meter. So the resolution here is 1 square meter. So I have a point for every 1 square meter, and I'll make the calculations based on that. So calculating the slope, it will look at the points, neighboring points, and then see what is the slope for each parcel. And you can see some buildings get a really nice results. Like this one, you can see red is high slope, blue is low, so quite horizontal. You can see on the sides of the buildings there is an equal slope like this. Whereas on the left side, you see some red dots, so I'm guessing it's getting some points from the walls already, so that would be an error. And interestingly, you see on the top of the roof, on the ridge, where it's like peaking, it will actually, the algorithm will estimate that it's horizontal there, so that's a little error coming from this approach. Otherwise, up here, for example, you see these red areas. That's when you have, it's one building, but it has different levels of roofs, so it will take points from up here and down here, and it will say that the slope is quite vertical when we can actually verify and see that it's just different levels of the rooftop. So those I would just eliminate them. So to calculate the solar potential, I only take slopes that are less than 60 degrees to eliminate walls, trees, and such mistakes. So down here, you can also see a lot of red on what would otherwise be a normal rooftop. So this tree was probably bigger at the time of getting the LiDAR data. So it would like give error values there, or you can actually see that it looks like the shape of a tree. So trees do come in the way, but on the other hand, once we can calculate the solar potential, we do account for the trees. So in calculating the solar potential, it's good. In just looking at slopes, it will give you some errors, but if you compare, or if you actually know the house, then you can know where the results are coming from, or where odd kind of results would come from. Calculating the aspect would be similar. So you have aspect or the orientation towards north, south, or east or west. The values go from 0 to 360, and hence the surfaces facing north will be either blue or red. That's why you have the contrast on the north side surfaces here, and here. And again, this building, that's kind of an easy example there. It captures quite well the east versus west, and then this little triangle here that is kind of facing south. Then to talk about how it's calculating the solar potential. So the results of the model is already shown on the left side. So what it does is for every square meter, what I've done in here, you can do it in different ways or different time frames. I've looked at the solar potential, solar radiation arriving on that point throughout the year. So model will look at the trajectory of the sun across the sky in different months. So it'll have a day for each month, a typical day, or because the sun has a different trajectory, and a half-hourly resolution during the day, so how the sun will pass each point. So what it does, because it has the surface model of the surroundings, it will take into account all the trees, hills, and buildings that come along the way in that resolution. And hence you will see, Mount Eden is there, this building here will be quite blue because it has trees shading it, and this part again will have less solar potential than the side on this side that doesn't have trees on the north side. On this side you'll see this tree here shading, so you'll have a lot of blue on that side even though it's north facing. And then again this house has a nice clear view for the sun on the north side, so you'll have a big red area there. Then I need to decide how to go from these calculations, these detailed calculations, to either actually give something tangible for a house owner, or for statistical purposes for retailers, or for the Auckland Council or policymakers. So I thought I need to somehow start rating the houses and do some statistics on them. And I'm assuming now, I think it's fair to assume that you put the solar panels on the best location on your rooftop. So hence I will start looking at the best, for example, 14 square meters of each rooftop, because that would be generally the north-facing side, and that's where you would put the solar panels. So I can look at the best 14 square meters, which correspond more or less to maybe a 2 kilowatt system, so to a smaller scale PV system. In addition, I've done it for the best 20 square meters, which is, I think, the current normal size of installed PV systems, around 3 kilowatts. I've also done for best 28 and 36, assuming that those are then future sizes of PV systems, and those would then already come with batteries. So if we get the batteries in, as we all know they're coming, accessible batteries. So with larger PV systems, you already need the batteries, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to consume your energy, wouldn't make any savings on that. So this example is for the best 14 square meters. And I was looking at the best 14 square meters, what's the total annual solar radiation on that per square meter for those best 14 square meters. And I then just rated it from less than 1,100 kilowatt hours per square meter to up to 1,500, and gave it a rating from 1 to 5. The share in Auckland is that in the top 5 you have less than 2%. Most of them are in the category 4. So this is kind of a good way to just map them and just compare, but obviously you'd want to have a better value for that. So probably each house obviously has the actual value for that, so that will then come with the data for that house.
How would you get a 5? There's no 5s on here, right?
No, this is...
How do you get one?
You don't have trees and you just have a nice surface facing north. Yeah, I'll show you a 5. Yeah, this is Mount Eden. I just kind of like this example because you see the shading so easily. So you get a bit of shading from the trees and everything. So, And it's an area we all kind of recognize, so it's kind of easy to zoom into. Pukekohe West has 5s. So if we compare neighborhoods, so that's again Mount Eden on that side, you see a lot of 4s. 4 is not bad. Let's not say that 4 is bad, but if we then compare to Pukekohe West, you have a lot of 5s, and you immediately see that that area doesn't have as many trees. They might be growing, so this might not be a 20-year result, but for now, it's valid. And you also see just how houses are built. All of them those are like really facing north and simple rooftops. A lot of the Mount Eden houses have very many segments, so that also kind of is not as suitable. And I think it is reflected in the data, in the results. So just a comparison between neighborhoods. And just to point out, the results do not come from how sunny it is in one place or the other. In this model, I assume it's equally sunny everywhere. So the differences in these results come only from the type of houses, the shapes of the rooftops, and what's surrounding them. So the trees and buildings and hills that are surrounding that house. So if I then take all the ratings per houses and per neighborhood, and count an average, just calculate the average rating for each neighborhood, then we can rate the neighborhoods kind of. But remember, these ratings tell more about the house types. So again, it's not to say that part is sunny. It's just to say that the rooftops there are mainly optimally built towards the sun. And so it's more about the rooftops themselves. So here's the best 20 so-called neighborhoods. In the future, of course, we could then look at what does this mean? Where do the differences come from? Is it new neighborhoods that are currently built more north-facing, or is it just the trees, or where do the differences come from? So that could be an interesting thing to look at newer neighborhoods, to divide by the construction years, for example, between neighborhoods. If we then look at individual rooftops, so this is just to say that the best house is not necessarily in the red zone. So if I looked at just the top 20 houses which have the best 36 square meters for solar energy, the first one is in Opanuku. I don't know if these are the official names for these neighborhoods by the area units. That's on the west side, basically in Waitakere, already neighboring Waitakere, or I'm not sure if that's already Waitakere's area per se. Most of them will be in Bombay. In the top 20, you have 11 houses in Bombay, which is down south. So that makes a lot of sense. But it's kind of curious to see that some of the houses are not. They can be in green or yellow zones. And the house there is the best house for solar power in New Zealand, in the Auckland region, according to this study. So is that anyone's house? They have a boat. Yeah, so I hope I'm not breaching privacy by showing that. But yeah, that's like on the Waitakeres of Scenic Road, actually. So, but they don't have any trees on the north side, close enough to shade, and they have a nice north-facing roof areas. And then a bit about putting those numbers into context. So all my results are just about the solar energy hitting the rooftop. So I'm not assuming technologies, I'm not assuming that will go in one direction or the other, just so that anyone who would use the results can assume their own technology, their own efficiency, and then their own area. So that's what I'm giving per square meter solar radiation. But obviously we want to kind of have an idea what that might mean in terms of electricity for Auckland. So I have a few kind of back of the envelope basic calculations to give an idea of how much electricity that might convert to. So if we just have a wild scenario, we take all of these houses in my study. So remember, some of them are excluded for one reason or the other, but 500,000 houses, and cover them, all the rooftops, completely in, let's assume, thin film technology. So a cheap technology that we'll assume that we'll just lay it on top, either paint it or just put a textile or something that's, a nice future technology. With a cheap technology, so we only have a 5% efficiency. If we did that for all of these houses, we'd get around almost 5,000 gigawatt hours. that's kind of a bold number. Just if we take a more realistic scenario, so let's say we take a quarter of these houses, 25%, and use the best 14 square meters. So we put a smallish PV system on and use a conservative 12% system efficiency, so panel plus inverter, etc. So what comes between the sun and then what goes into the grid. You'd get roughly 300 gigawatt hours. If we then compare it to what Auckland Council has as their goals, they have a goal to have 176,565 houses equivalent PV powering of that. They probably started with a different number, which then became equivalent to that. But so if we assume that an average household consumes about 8,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a year, that would give you from those houses a demand of 1,400 gigawatt hours, roughly. In order to reach that, with the results from this study, you'd need then roughly 250,000 rooftops using the best 36 square meters, so kind of big systems compared to what is currently being installed. Not huge, but bigger than what's currently being installed. Then you'd get roughly a similar energy output. So that's the general conclusion. I would say these results would be slightly conservative. I have made sure that I'm not giving overly optimistic or anything. So both the solar results in kilowatt hours are slightly conservative if we compare to the NIWA tool online. North-facing surfaces are better than for other orientations, but it's still about 5% lower results than what the NIWA tool would give. And then, of course, the efficiencies I'm using here are quite, well, you can argue both ways. Anyone can use the efficiencies they want to generate the results they want, basically. But that's the overall conclusions of my study, and I'll finish here and let Tony continue.
All right, thanks very much, Kiti. So what I'm wanting to do, kind of following on from what Kiti's been talking about, is kind of put a little bit of this into context in terms of what are the economic incentives for getting into solar, given what the potential looks like for different types of houses. So I'm coming at this from kind of an economics-y point of view, but my background is in sort of engineering science, which is optimization. So I like to think about things from kind of an optimally efficient point of view, as well as thinking about risk and other things. So I want to start off by just using a quote from the Energy in New Zealand 2015 report that MB put out recently, which sort of was saying that in kind of nominal terms, residential prices have gone up about 3.8%, or in terms of costs for residential consumers. And the main driver of that increase is to do with distribution and transmission charges that are being passed through. And distribution and transmission are effectively fixed costs that kind of get incurred in large, discrete investments, and they need to be spread over the customers that use them. So the fewer customers that use them, or the less energy they demand, the higher you need to sort of charge to get the investment costs back. So that's going to be something that I come back to later on. But if we look back a bit further, also from this MB report, the solid line is kind of the $2015 plot for the effective electricity price that people pay in cents per kilowatt hour. And so over the last 40 years, it's kind of doubled after inflation. So after you've taken inflation into account, it's effectively a doubling of the cost. And there are a bunch of reasons why this has happened for residentials. One of the arguments is that over time, since the market's been put in place, the subsidy of industry for transmission and things like that have reduced, and so residentials are kind of bearing more of the fair share of what the true costs of providing power actually are. So that's really what's happening. And so the question is, how do these increases kind of look going forward, and how does that affect the incentives for people kind of going towards solar as an alternative, and whether solar truly is a disruptive technology. So if we look at the breakdown of what people pay for when they pay their bill, it contains a whole lot of different things. The particular sizes here I don't think are current. This is a couple of years old. But in essence, this dark brown area is the generation component. That's the fuel or the water that you're paying for. And you've got blue transmission. This yellow region is distribution. You've got some metering charges. The retail is here. This is kind of the retail markup, but it's probably not quite as large as that anymore, given the kind of extra competition that's occurred recently in the retail sector. And then you've kind of got GST on the top of that. So when you install a solar panel, you're eliminating kind of all of these costs when you substitute a kilowatt hour of solar for a kilowatt hour of power from the grid in a variable sense. So what is happening for you is you're saving all of this, but what's happening for the grid is they're kind of saving this area down here, the fuel cost. And you've kind of cut out the middleman, you've cut out the retailer a little bit, and so there won't be any tax being taken by the government. But the country as a whole is kind of still bearing the cost of having the lines in place, the distribution assets, and the transmission lines. So from the country's perspective, it's a very different story than your perspective. You're paying 25 cents a kilowatt hour, but when you disconnect, you only save the country 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And so there's a different perspective that different agents in this market would kind of take, and it will lead to different results. So we want to kind of look at that in a bit of detail. So what I've said is that the costs of the transmission and distribution are fixed, but that doesn't mean that they're kind of constant costs, because if you don't kind of find more efficient or better alternatives, you'll have to keep building larger and larger distribution networks and larger transmission lines. And those cost money going forward. So it's possible that if we used something like the tool Kiti's provided, we could say selectively choose to install solar and batteries in different regions to get kind of the most efficient installation of solar, to support the distribution network, to support not having to build an additional set of lines or extra capacity to get water up from the South Island to the North Island if you've got solar in place. And you need to look at the costs of that, but it's possible that it can provide a support in a small sense to defer or kind of prevent additional unnecessary costs that can be quite large. So the question is whether or not this is a disruptive technology at the moment, and whether or not, looking forward, whether it will actually end up displacing the electricity grid as we know it. So looking at the current costs, so I got these off one of the solar websites. They more or less all have similar numbers here. So we've got the standard installation of 3 kilowatt panel is about 20 square meters and costs around $10,000 fully installed. And battery storage, this is kind of very approximate. There's no kind of hard numbers that I can access without buying a battery myself to figure out how much this would cost. But it's around $6,000 to get a 7 kilowatt hour battery. So how many dollars worth of energy does a 7 kilowatt hour battery store if it's fully charged? $1,000? It's about $1.20. So, so you've got a kilowatt hour. So cents per kilowatt hour is what you're paying. You're paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So storing maybe $1 or so of energy that you would not having to buy from the grid if you can discharge that battery. So yeah, kilowatt hours, not big, massive things. So it's not actually providing a huge amount of storage in that sense, but it can work well with solar. So you charge it up and then you discharge it, and you can make sure that you utilize the solar to avoid having to sell back and avoid having to kind of buy from the grid during the evenings. So what we're going to do is just a small case study. It's very high level, nothing too detailed in it, looking at an individual house's or a couple of individual houses solar potential, thinking about the payback period and the risks that these householders, homeowners will face when they purchase and install a solar panel. So the first key thing is the idea of a payback period. So this is a very common concept when you think about net present value and investments. So if you've got a rational utility maximizer, which I'm sure everyone is, depending on what their utility is, you don't really know, but they're going to maximize something. It could be that they just want to kind of maximize their profit, minimize their costs. And they're going to think about the discounted rate of return of this investment over time. So in this case, you install a solar panel and the return is not having to buy electricity from the grid. And what we'll think about is the number of years it takes to kind of recoup the initial cost. But in conjunction with this, there's also risks. So you've got potential maintenance costs. You've got the potential that power might not be as available as you hoped. You have kind of winter days where there's not much sun, and you're needing to buy quite a lot from the grid in those types of periods. But you've also got kind of other types of costs, opportunity costs, which are an opportunity cost is if you install in a solar panel today and tomorrow they're 20% cheaper, you kind of regret having installed it today. So the fact that they are continually decreasing in price means it might be a good idea to think about delaying until pretty much you've only got, different people have different thresholds for investing, so there'll be different people who are investing at different points. So the other kind of risk is the price of energy on the grid itself. So if the price of energy starts falling because all the gas plants go off, kind of get shut down in Auckland, which has happened recently, and you get a whole lot more renewables on the grid, geothermal has taken off, and other customers start moving to solar, it could be that energy prices start dropping for a short period of time, and you've bought the solar thinking that this is the price of energy, but in fact it actually drops. So that's a risk that you are taking. And then the other thing is you're tying up 10 grand, 16 grand in this capital item. What if you need that money for something else? It's no longer available. You can't just take it off the roof and get your money back. There are kind of deals where you can do these rent-to-own type schemes, or effectively someone else owns the solar panel on your roof. But if you were to buy it outright for yourself, then that's a risk that you face. So the case study we're going to look at kind of compares the two suburbs that Kiti showed, which are the Mount Eden and Pukekohe suburbs. And we're using kind of an average rooftop area with putting a 20 square metre set of panels on there, and thinking about kind of a good red house for Pukekohe and a kind of a yellowish house in the Mount Eden area, and sort of thinking about what are the incentives for people who live in those areas to purchase these panels. So I went to the census and I had a look at income to kind of know what is the effectively willingness for people to spend money, how much disposable income might they have, and things like that, to determine what might be a reasonable discount rate, which sort of tells them the value of money going forward over time. So in Mount Eden, I just kind of ballparked to 4%, which is kind of what mortgage rates are heading towards these days. So if you could put the extra $10,000 straight onto a mortgage and the bank is happy with that, then you would effectively be paying 4% on that. So that would be your discount rate that you'd be looking at. And what I've got is this graph here, which is the payback period up here versus what the overall price inflation over time has been for retail prices. So if retail prices drop, your payback period effectively rises, because it's going to take longer for you to recover what would have been the costs that you actually are incurring because, or would have incurred because there would have been cheaper electricity available. If electricity prices rise at 5%, then you get a payback period of 10 years, which starts looking more attractive. So if you think it's going to rise rapidly, then maybe going with solar is a reasonable idea.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Sorry, is that nominal or real?
So that is the nominal inflation. So I've got a discount rate and then I've got an inflation rate, and they're kind of separate things. And so if we went to Pukekohe, there's a $20,000 kind of income difference there. There's also going to be a house price difference as well. So you can't just look at that and say one group of people have higher disposable income than another, but I kind of did that. But just as a kind of illustration. And so what I said here was maybe they wouldn't be able to put it on the mortgage, and you would have to assume maybe a higher discount rate because they would have to effectively borrow money or use money that they would want to use for something else to install these panels. And so there's a higher kind of time value of money that is going on here. But they do have a better solar potential. So we've got 3,800 kilowatt hours here, so about 20% more kind of solar potential. And you get a similar picture in terms of the overall payback period, taking into account the retail price inflation. But if the person from Mount Eden who had the 4% rate kind of had that same solar potential, you would see that actually you kind of have a maximum of a 12-year payback period for this person because they've got a kind of a lower discount factor, higher discount factor, lower discount rate, meaning that they're able to invest and get their money back more quickly. And so in the States, there's actually a company that's looking at installing solar panel on other people's houses. So if your house isn't very good for solar, you can kind of install it on kind of in the cloud. You know, you sort of install, you say, I just want to get solar panels, and they'll install it somewhere else where someone else says, I'm willing to give my roof up. And you're able to kind of trade on that. So that could be a solution to this if it was actually the right outcome for New Zealand to have these solar panels installed. But New Zealand's a little bit different from other countries where they've been supporting solar quite a lot in the California market and places like that, because we've already got, in kind of a good hydrology year, so we've got lots of water, about 80% 80% renewables in our system in terms of the gigawatt hours, the total energy that's being produced. And so that's kind of the blue area up here is the hydro, and then at the bottom you've got some other geothermal and wind all the way up. This is 2014 is the last year on this. So because of this, it becomes more questionable about what the true benefits of solar are, because you'll offset maybe some gas and some coal. Huntley's saying that it's shutting down in a couple of years, so the coal won't be there anymore. So you'll be offsetting a little bit of gas, but if you install too much solar, you start offsetting other renewables, right? And the question is, these renewables have already been built, but we're buying panels from overseas, bringing them in to offset things that already exist in New Zealand. So from New Zealand's point of view, that definitely wouldn't be a great use of money. But from the consumer's point of view, with the current pricing schemes, that's potentially what the incentives are going to be. It's going to be saying, I can avoid paying for the distribution lines, for the transmission lines, by going to solar, and I'll leave someone else to pay for those. Okay? And that's going to be coming to a head very shortly as these prices continue to drop. And I just want to point out that residential load hasn't actually increased on the grid substantially since 2008. Things have been pretty flat, and it peaked in 2010, and then there was the Canterbury earthquake, and things sort of dropped slightly, and then there's just been general efficiencies that have meant that prices haven't really moved in spite of the growing population. And so that brings, I guess the previous point I was making brings us to the idea of stranded assets, which is if we're having people incentivized to move to solar through the pricing schemes we use, what can happen is the first person might move to solar because they see it as a green alternative. It might not have economic value to move to solar. They'll move there for other reasons. And then what that will do is leave fewer and fewer people using power on the grid. In the kind of their overall demand will decrease, and so you'll have fewer kilowatt hours being purchased, and they'll have to put more and more, increase the price for those customers that are left behind. And as that price increases, more and more customers will be incentivized to move to solar until you get to a point where you kind of have people who can't move to solar and then the people who have moved to solar. And the people who can't are left kind of bearing the costs, as well as the distribution companies who may not be able to charge the required amounts to recover the cost that they've incurred in installing things. And the two things are kind of overbuilt lines and underutilization of renewable energy. These are the threats, and we need to think about, well, is this actually going to happen in New Zealand? And if it could happen, what steps would you need to take to kind of mitigate things, either from the way that we charge customers or from the way that we kind of think about investment? Okay. And so one of the kind of buzzwords that's coming around is, it's not really a buzzword, it's an accurate term, is the idea of cost-reflective pricing, where at the moment a high proportion of lines are charged as variable costs, but in fact lines are built and there's a fixed kind of cost that's needing to be recovered from those. And so what's the right way of charging people for the lines that they're using appropriately? And the key thing is, if you don't have a battery installed, you're still going to need in the evenings to buy power from the grid, so your peak demand, which is kind of the 6 p.m. type of demand, is still going to be the same. And so this is a picture from Californian ISO, where they've heavily kind of subsidized and promoted solar, and they're predicting this thing called the duck curve, where this is the 2013, and then you kind of have projections 2015 to 2020 about during the day you've got very little electricity needed from the grid, and it's only during the evening peak where the sun's not shining that you need to purchase from the grid. So what this means is that effectively you've got a massive ramp required. You need these plants that are able to start up quickly and actually get to full load very, very rapidly in the evening to try to support the fact that the overall solar is dropping down. So that kind of requires more gas plants, and plants like that are able to react in that fashion, which is not necessarily a good thing. And you still have to build all the lines that you've built before, but you now don't have the customers buying as much power from the grid. Okay, so you need to think of ways of actually recouping those costs effectively. So I just want to give an overall conclusion to some of the points that we've talked about today. So based on some of the things Kiti's discussed, distribution companies or solar panel installers or companies kind of selling these solar panels might be able to use their technology to advertise to or kind of select particular customers who would be good for solar to maximize the efficiency that you're getting from those panels. And that can support the grid in different ways by deferring or avoiding investments in distribution lines and other things. Of course, batteries will have to form a part of that if we're wanting to actually drop the peak loads. And solar generation, if we keep with current pricing, will definitely become an attractive thing for households that have got good roofs and sunny areas. And so we need to think from the country's point of view whether or not that's the right incentive that we should be signalling, what impact that has on the system as a whole, and we need to price that more appropriately. Okay, that's it.